Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into two big ideas about freedom, ideas that shape a lot of our debates: classic American liberalism and libertarianism.
Right.
And you might think, okay, freedom, liberty, they sound similar, maybe even related.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
But as we're going to unpack today, you'll find they are fundamentally, profoundly different in how they see the world.
Indeed. Yeah, they both definitely champion individual liberty, that's true. But what liberty means, what it's for, well, that's where they part ways pretty dramatically.
Exactly.
We'll be looking at, a liberty that's tied to reason, to virtue, versus one that really centers almost exclusively on consent and not aggressing against others.
And understanding that difference, it's not just academic, right?
Yeah.
It hits everything: laws, communities, how we even think about our own choices.
Absolutely. Real world stuff.
So our goal today, our mission, is to give you real clarity. We'll look at what each philosophy actually stands for, where these ideas came from,
Their intellectual roots, yeah.
and crucially, how their different takes on government, on morality, even on, the purpose of life itself, how all that shapes what we think a free society really looks like.
We want to cut through some of the noise, the assumptions around these terms.
Okay, so let's dive in and unpack this. Now, before we jump headfirst into libertarianism, which might be maybe more familiar in name to some folks today, it's really important we ground ourselves first. Let's talk about the philosophy of the American founding, classic American liberalism.
Yes, absolutely essential.
And I think for a lot of listeners, you hear liberalism and your mind probably snaps to modern politics, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. Not at all.
That's a critical distinction to make right up front. Yeah, the term's meaning has shifted significantly over time.
So what defines this older tradition, this classic American liberalism? What are its core components?
Well, classic American liberalism is really the intellectual engine behind the American founding. It's not just a loose collection of sentiments. It's a pretty coherent philosophy.
Oh.
It's built on a few key pillars. The idea of natural rights we have just by being human.
Life, liberty, property, those ones.
Exactly. Rights that government doesn't give you, but is supposed to protect. Then there's the idea of a real objective moral law, a sense of right and wrong that exists beyond just our opinions.
Okay, so not just whatever we decide is right today.
Precisely. And third, the belief in our capacity for self-government, both individually and collectively. It offers a, let's say, richer, more textured understanding of liberty than just being left alone.
A richer understanding. How so?
Well, the core definition is key here. Liberty, in this view, isn't just the absence of restraint. It's not a void.
Okay.
Instead, it's defined quite specifically as the freedom to do what is right.
The freedom to do what's right.
Right. And what is right isn't seen as purely subjective. It's understood as being guided by reason, by virtue, moral character, and crucially by the rule of law. This is a fundamental break from just thinking of freedom as doing whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anyone. It's liberty for something specific, something higher.
Liberty for pursuing a good life, maybe? Guided by these principles?
Exactly. It's liberty directed towards a discovered good, not just freedom from interference. That concept sets the stage for everything else we'll discuss.
Okay, so it's not a blank check then. It's more like, well, you used the word roadmap earlier. A roadmap for human flourishing, guided by reason and morality.
That's a good way to put it. And this wasn't just pulled out of thin air. This tradition has deep intellectual roots.
Where did these ideas come from, primarily?
They drew heavily from traditions like Scottish Enlightenment thinkers like Francis Hutcheson, Adam Smith, Thomas Reid.
Okay, I've heard those names.
And also what's sometimes called common sense realism. The core belief underpinning these sources was that a moral order is real. It's knowable through reason and experience, and it exists independently of what we might want or prefer.
So like discovering laws of physics, but for morality.
In a sense, yes. They believed humans have an innate moral sense, a capacity to discern right from wrong, an inclination towards certain virtues like justice, benevolence, prudence. It's not just about utility or self-interest.
A kind of built-in compass.
Precisely. And this belief in an objective moral order is why the founders could talk about self-evident truths and unalienable rights. They weren't just making it up. They believed these were rooted in the nature of reality, in a moral truth that transcends human laws or agreements.
That context makes those phrases in the Declaration feel much weightier.
It does. And it directly shapes how classic American liberalism views the role of government.
Right, let's get into that. If liberty is about pursuing the good, what's the government's job?
It has a dual purpose, really. Both are vital. First, and fundamentally, government exists to secure those natural rights we talked about: life, liberty, property. Protect them from infringement, whether by other individuals or by the government itself.
The protection function. Basic, but essential.
Absolutely essential. But there's a second role, which is often misunderstood or downplayed today. Government also has a role in, let's say, sustaining the conditions necessary for virtue and a healthy civil society to flourish.
Okay, now that sounds tricky. Does that mean the government enforces virtue, tells people how to live?
That's the common concern, but no, that's not quite it. It's not about imposing virtue directly through force, like creating a morality police. It's more subtle.
How so?
Think of it more like cultivating a moral ecology, creating an environment where it's possible and easier for people to develop virtue, exercise self-government responsibly, and participate in community life.
Like a gardener tending the soil.
Exactly like that. The gardener doesn't force the plant to grow, but provides the right conditions: good soil, water, sunlight. So historically, this could mean things like promoting public education focused on civic virtue.
Teaching kids about responsibility, citizenship.
Right. Or protecting religious liberty because they believe religious institutions often fostered morality necessary for self-government. Or structuring laws in ways that supported strong families or local community bonds.
So it's about shaping the environment, the background conditions, not dictating personal choices directly.
Precisely. It's about building a society where living a good, virtuous life is encouraged and facilitated by the structure of governance, even if not directly compelled by it. It's a partnership, in a way, between government and civil society to foster the character needed for freedom. This is a very different vision from a purely hands-off minimalist state that just prevents harm.
Okay, that clarifies it. Liberty for cultivating virtue and a flourishing society. It's a positive vision, not just a negative one of leave me alone. That really does set the stage for understanding the alternative.
Exactly. So with that foundation of classic American liberalism, liberty ordered toward the good, supported by a limited but purposeful government, let's pivot now. Let's turn our attention to libertarianism. This philosophy approaches freedom from a distinctly different angle. And it's gained a lot of traction, especially in recent decades.
It feels very focused on the individual, almost radically so sometimes. So if classic American liberalism is liberty for something, what's the absolute core principle, the bedrock of libertarianism?
At its very heart, libertarianism is built on one central idea.
Mm-hmm.
All human interactions must be voluntary. Absolutely voluntary, free from coercion.
Okay, no force.
No initiated force. And this crystallizes into its core doctrine, the principle you hear most often, the non-aggression principle, usually shortened to NIP.
The NIP, right.
This isn't just a guideline. For most libertarians, it's the ultimate moral command in the political sphere.
And what exactly does it state?
Simply put, it states that it is morally wrong to initiate force or the threat of force against another person or their legitimately owned property.
Initiate being the key word there. So self-defense is okay.
Yes. Defensive force is generally considered legitimate. The prohibition is against starting the aggression. This covers obvious things like physical assault, theft, fraud.
Makes sense.
But, and this is crucial from a libertarian perspective, it also extends to many common government actions. Things like taxation.
Taxation, how is that aggression?
Well, the argument is that it's taking property without explicit individual consent. If you don't pay your taxes, eventually men with guns will show up to compel payment or seize assets. That's seen as initiated force.
Okay.
Same goes for many regulations telling a business owner how they must run their business, what they can sell, who they must hire. That's seen as infringing on their property rights without their consent. Conscription, obviously, is compelling service.
So the definition of aggression here is very broad, covering any non-consensual interference with person or property, even by the state.
Exactly. And that leads directly to the next point. Legitimacy comes only from consent. Explicit individual consent.
Only from consent.
If you haven't personally agreed to it, then any authority trying to compel you is, by definition, illegitimate, according to this view. No social contract arguments, no greater good justifications override individual consent.
Wow, that's stringent.
It is, and it naturally leads to a profoundly individualistic view of liberty. Unlike classic American liberalism, which sees liberty as connected to virtue and community.
Right, liberty for something.
Libertarianism tends to treat liberty primarily as an end in itself. It's the right to be left alone, freedom from interference, full stop.
And how you use that freedom,
is largely irrelevant from a political or legal standpoint as long as you don't violate the NAP. The moral quality of your choices, whether they're wise or foolish, constructive or destructive, doesn't factor into whether your liberty should be protected.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, like you said, because that sharp focus, almost exclusively on non-aggression and consent,
Yeah.
that seems to be the absolute dividing line. What does that mean for everything else, for society?
It has massive implications. Think about it. If the absolute highest moral good in the political realm is non-coercion, then what happens?
Yeah.
It means that personal choices, even choices that might seem incredibly self-destructive or harmful to the person making them.
Like substance abuse, or maybe neglecting basic health.
Exactly. Or maybe choices that seem socially corrosive, like extreme isolation, or refusing any kind of community involvement that isn't strictly contractual, as long as those choices don't involve initiating force against someone else.
Then they're okay, or at least off limits for interference.
They are considered outside the legitimate scope of concern for the state, or even for society acting collectively in any coercive way. Your choices are your own, period, provided you respect the NAP. There's no external standard of flourishing or the good life that can justify overriding your consent.
It's a stark difference, a really stark difference.
Now, this modern libertarianism, it didn't just appear overnight. It has a distinct intellectual history, largely shaped by thinkers in the 20th century.
Right, it's not Plato or Aristotle we're talking about here. Who are the key figures we should know? Because I get the sense there's some variety within libertarianism itself.
There definitely is. It's not monolithic.
Yeah.
But key figures would include people like Murray Rothbard, Ayn Rand, Robert Nozick,
Okay.
and also economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who are central to its economic thinking, even if they didn't always identify strictly as libertarian in the modern political sense.
What ties them together, despite their differences?
Well, there are a few common threads. A deep, deep skepticism of government power is probably number one.
Okay.
A strong belief in the power and efficiency, and often the morality of free markets.
Right.
And a shared conviction that political power should never be used to engineer specific social or moral outcomes. They all saw centralized authority as fundamentally an obstacle to human flourishing, creativity, and freedom.
The state as the problem, essentially.
Often, yes, or at least a necessary evil to be minimized as much as humanly possible. But within that shared skepticism, there's definitely a spectrum.
Can you give us a sense of that spectrum?
Sure. At one end, you have Murray Rothbard.
Right.
He represents the anarcho-capitalist wing.
Anarcho-capitalist. No state at all.
Exactly. Rothbard argued that the state itself is inherently illegitimate. He saw it as a coercive monopoly on violence, essentially a criminal gang writ large.
Wow.
In his view, all services, including things we normally think of as state functions, police, courts, national defense, should be provided by competing private businesses in a free market. Everything based on voluntary contracts.
So private police forces, private courts?
Yes. Governed only by the non-aggression principle, enforced through private means like arbitration or private security. It's a vision of pure individual sovereignty.
Okay, that's one end. What about others? You mentioned Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand is a fascinating figure. She developed her own philosophy, objectivism, which includes a strong defense of rational egoism, the idea that pursuing one's own rational self-interest is the highest moral purpose.
Self-interest as a virtue.
Productive self-interest, yes. She celebrated the individual creator, the entrepreneur, the thinker. Her philosophy is intensely individualistic and anti-collectivist. While she supported a minimal state, unlike Rothbard, her core focus was on individual achievement and the rejection of altruism as a primary moral duty. Her novels, like Atlas Shrugged, are powerful expressions of this view.
Right, the heroic individual against the collective.
Precisely. Then you have thinkers like Mises and Hayek from the Austrian School of Economics. Their focus was perhaps less on abstract rights theory and more on the practical impossibility and dangers of central planning.
The economic critique.
Yes. They argued forcefully that complex economies simply cannot be managed effectively from the top down because the necessary knowledge is dispersed among millions of individuals. Only free markets, with price signals and competition, can coordinate this knowledge effectively.
The idea of spontaneous order.
Exactly. Hayek in particular emphasized how complex social institutions, including markets and even law to some extent, emerge organically from human action, not from deliberate design. They stressed economic liberty and warned against the fatal conceit of believing planners could outperform the market.
So, a range of views. No state, Minimal state focused on rational self-interest, minimal state justified by economic efficiency and knowledge limits, but all converging on drastically limiting or eliminating state power based on non-aggression and consent.
That's a good summary. They share the core principles, but the application and justification can vary quite a bit.
Okay, so we have these two pictures emerging. Classic American liberalism, liberty for virtue, within a framework of law and a limited but necessary state, and libertarianism, liberty from coercion, based on non-aggression and consent, leading to calls for minimal or no state.
Right.
Now, while classic American liberalism definitely fears tyranny and values individual rights, that's common ground. It seems the divergence after that is massive. What's the absolute core of that divergence? Where do they fundamentally part ways?
It really comes down to the purpose of liberty. That's the heart of it. Why do we value freedom? What is it for? They give radically different answers.
Okay.
Classic American liberalism, as we've established, believes liberty is for something specific. It's instrumental. It's the condition that allows us to pursue virtue, fulfill our moral duties as rational beings, exercise reason, and build a good community.
The means to a higher end.
Exactly. It's not just about being left alone. It's about living well. And living well implies a standard, a moral framework rooted in human nature and reason. Liberty enables us to strive towards that standard.
A standard that exists outside of just individual preference.
Yes. It's tied to an objective understanding of human flourishing. Remember James Wilson, the founder we mentioned?
Yes, the quote about liberty and law.
His quote perfectly captures this. Without liberty, law loses its nature and its name and becomes oppression. Without law, liberty also loses its nature and its name and becomes licentiousness.
Let's unpack that a bit. Law without liberty is tyranny.
Right, arbitrary power.
But liberty without law becomes licentiousness. What does that mean exactly? Just chaos.
It means freedom detached from responsibility, from moral guidance, from the common good. It's unrestrained desire leading to self-indulgence, maybe even self-destruction, and ultimately the breakdown of social order where nobody's rights are actually secure. Wilson saw law and liberty as interdependent, not enemies.
So law isn't just a constraint on freedom, it's also what makes true freedom possible, by providing order and guiding it towards good ends.
Precisely. Law shapes the conditions for responsible freedom. Think of the banks of a river that constrain the water, yes, but they also give it direction and power. Without the banks, it's just a swamp.
Yeah.
For classic American liberalism, law provides the banks for liberty.
Okay, that image helps. Ordered liberty. But I can hear the counter-argument already. Libertarian might say, who decides what law or order or the good is? Isn't that just opening the door for the state to impose its values and crush individual choice?
That's the perennial tension, isn't it? And a valid concern. The classic liberal response would be that the good isn't just invented by the state, it's discovered through reason, rooted in natural law, and reflected in traditions that have stood the test of time. The law's role is to align with that pre-existing moral order, protecting rights and fostering virtue, but always within strict limits to prevent tyranny. It's a delicate balance.
A balance between preventing oppression and preventing licentiousness.
Exactly. It's seeking freedom within an ethical framework, not simply freedom from all frameworks. This balance is the defining characteristic that sets it apart from the more purely negative conception of freedom in libertarianism. And this difference plays out massively in how they view the state. Yeah, the role and legitimacy of the state is probably the most practical and significant point of divergence. Their views are poles apart.
We touched on the libertarian spectrum, minimal state to no state. Can you flesh that out a bit more? What does that night-watchman state actually do?
Right, the night-watchman state, often associated with minimal statism or minarchism, its functions are incredibly restricted.
Like,
Basically, police to protect against violence, theft, fraud, courts to adjudicate disputes and enforce contracts, and a military for national defense against external threats.
and that's it.
That's essentially it.
That's
No
it.
public schools, no social security, no environmental regulations beyond direct property violations, no infrastructure projects funded by taxes, unless maybe directly for defense, no drug laws, no subsidies, no government health care.
Wow. So almost everything we think of as government services would be gone or handled privately.
Handled privately, yes.
Yeah.
Through the market, through charity, through voluntary associations. The state's only job is to enforce the NAP and contracts and then get out of the way. It's purely a protector of negative rights.
Okay, that's the minimal state end. What about the more radical view, the anarcho-capitalists like Rothbard?
For them, even the night-watchman state goes too far. Their argument is that the state itself, by its very nature, is illegitimate.
Why? Because it claims a monopoly on force.
Exactly. And because it funds itself through coercion taxation, they see the state not as a protector of rights, but as the single biggest violator of rights in history.
So not just inefficient or sometimes corrupt, but fundamentally immoral.
Fundamentally immoral and unnecessary. They believe all its legitimate functions, protection, dispute resolution, could and should be provided competitively by private agencies in a free market. Private police, private courts, private defense agencies, all funded voluntarily through fees and contracts.
It's hard to even picture that society.
It's a radical vision, certainly. The core idea is that government isn't a necessary evil. It's an unnecessary one, a holdover from a less enlightened past that violates liberty by its very existence.
Okay, so libertarianism sees the state as, at best, a highly restricted tool, or at worst, an illegitimate aggressor. How does classic American liberalism view the state in comparison? It sounds like a completely different starting point.
It is a fundamentally different starting point. Classic American liberalism sees the state or government, political society, as something natural, moral, and necessary, provided it's properly limited.
Natural. How so?
Well, drawing on thinkers, going back to Aristotle, they see humans as naturally social and political beings. We form communities, and governance arises naturally from the need to order those communities, protect rights, and pursue common goods that individuals can't achieve alone. It's not an alien imposition, but an outgrowth of human nature itself.
So not the enemy of liberty.
Not inherently. A just government, operating within its proper constitutional bounds, is seen as the essential guardian of liberty. It protects citizens from threats, both internal and external, upholds the rule of law, and provides the stable framework within which true freedom can actually be exercised. Without it, you get chaos or the rule of the strong, neither of which is freedom.
So it rejects both extremes, too much state and no state.
Precisely. Classic American liberalism rejects both statism, where the government becomes all-powerful and crushes individual rights, and statelessness or anarchy, which they believed inevitably leads to disorder and violence, making liberty impossible for most. It seeks that middle ground, ordered liberty under limited government.
And its moral role. You mentioned it participates in the moral order.
Yes. The state doesn't create the moral order that comes from natural law, reason, maybe revelation for some thinkers, but the state is a participant in upholding aspects of it. Its laws should strive to be just, reflecting that higher moral law. It has a duty to protect the innocent, punish the guilty, and ensure justice. It operates under the moral law, not above it, and exists to protect those pre-political rights we have as humans.
So its legitimacy comes from serving justice and protecting rights.
Exactly. Yeah. Its purpose is derived from those ends. The founders believed in ordered liberty, remember. Not just abstract voluntarism or letting everyone do whatever they want. The goal wasn't for government to disappear, but to enable free people to govern themselves effectively, individually and collectively, within a just framework.
That distinction is huge. One sees the state as a moral necessity for freedom, the other as freedom's inherent enemy, or at best a dangerous tool that shapes everything.
Absolutely. And this leads us to what many critics see as perhaps the biggest challenge for libertarianism. It's perceived moral minimalism.
Moral minimalism. What do you mean by that? Leaving too much out of the moral picture?
In essence, yes. By focusing so intensely on consent and property rights as the be-all and end-all of political justice, it tends to sideline or ignore other crucial dimensions of human life and morality.
Like what?
Things like conscience, the deep human need for belonging and community beyond contracts, the idea of shared purpose, virtue, character formation. These aspects of human flourishing often seem secondary or entirely private within a strict libertarian framework.
So it raises some tough questions.
It really does. You get questions like, can you truly consent to vice? Meaning, even if an action is voluntary, can it still be wrong or harmful in a way that society should care about? Or can a society truly flourish if its only bounding principle is non-aggression? What happens if everyone is free to destroy themselves or ignore their neighbors or let community institutions crumble as long as they pay their bills and don't physically attack anyone? Is that really a successful society?
It sounds like a potentially very lonely or even degraded society, even if it's technically free by the NMIP standard.
That's the concern. And this is where classic American liberalism offers a sharp contrast. It insists that liberty needs to be ordered not primarily by state force, but by internal formation.
Formation. You mean education, character building.
Exactly. Character formation, moral education, the cultivation of virtues like self-control, responsibility, honesty, courage, civic-mindedness. And this formation doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Where does it happen?
It happens primarily through those foundational institutions that exist outside the state and often outside the pure market. The family, first and foremost. Religious institutions. Schools that teach more than just job skills. Local communities, voluntary associations, charities.
A whole network of civil society.
Precisely. These are the places where we learn how to be good people, good neighbors, good citizens. They provide the moral and social capital that allows a free society to function without constant policing. They teach the internal restraints necessary for external freedom.
Internal restraints. Self-governance of the soul, you called it earlier.
Yes. The founders were acutely aware of this. They knew that a constitution, no matter how brilliantly designed, couldn't sustain freedom if the people themselves lacked virtue. If citizens are driven solely by unchecked appetites and self-interest, the system breaks down.
That reminds me of the John Adams quote you mentioned.
It's worth repeating. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other.
That's powerful. He's saying the whole structure depends on the character of the citizens.
Absolutely. Not necessarily specific religious beliefs enforced by the state, but a shared moral understanding and the capacity for self-restraint that historically they believed religion often fostered. Without that internal moral compass guiding the citizens, freedom becomes unsustainable. Either chaos reigns or tyranny steps in to impose order.
Which brings us really to the deepest question of all, the one underlying these entire philosophies. What are we for? What's the point of being human? What's the ultimate purpose, the end of our freedom?
Exactly. This is the question of telos, the ultimate end or purpose. And here, the divergence is perhaps clearest.
So what answer does classic American liberalism give? What's the telos?
It gives a definite answer.
Yeah.
It holds that liberty exists so that human beings understood as rational, moral agents with conscience can pursue what is true, good, and just. The purpose of human life, the telos, is to flourish.
Flourish out.
By living in accordance with the moral law that's discoverable through reason and inherent in our nature. It's about developing our virtues, fulfilling our duties to God, for many founders, to each other and to the community. It's about striving for excellence, both moral and intellectual.
So liberty isn't just aimless, it has a built-in direction.
Yes. It's not value neutral in this view. It's fundamentally instrumental. It's the necessary tool, the path, that allows us to pursue that moral end. Cultivating virtue, fulfilling duty, building a just and flourishing society. Freedom is for becoming better people and creating a better common life.
Okay, that's a clear, if challenging, vision. How does libertarianism answer the question of telos? What is freedom for in that view?
Well, this is where libertarianism often becomes deliberately agnostic or even explicitly rejects the idea of a shared objective telos as being politically relevant.
Agnostic, meaning it doesn't claim to know or doesn't think it matters politically.
Both, often. For many libertarians, the only legitimate concern for politics or law is whether coercion, the initiation of force, has occurred. What you do with your freedom, your ultimate purpose, your definition of a good life, is considered entirely your own private business.
So whether you use your freedom to write poetry, or build a company, or watch cat videos all day, politically it's all the same, as long as you don't aggress.
From a strict NAP perspective, yes. The content of your choices, your personal telos, is irrelevant to the question of whether your liberty should be respected. There's no shared public standard of the good life that freedom is supposed to serve.
What kind of society does that lead to, conceptually?
It tends to lead to a vision of society as essentially a collection of autonomous individuals, bundles of rights and preferences, whose only necessary connection is the agreement not to aggress against each other. The highest political good becomes maximum freedom from interference, not necessarily the pursuit of collective excellence or shared values or moral formation.
It sounds very procedural, focused on the rules of interaction, not the goal.
That's a very good way to put it. Philosophically, you could say classic American liberalism is teleological. It's oriented towards an end, a purpose grounded in ideas about human nature and moral truth. Libertarianism, especially in its dominant forms, is largely procedural. It's concerned with the means, consent, non-aggression, but remains neutral or silent about the ultimate ends those means should serve.
That distinction feels incredibly important, because if a society forgets its telos, forgets why it values freedom, what happens then? Does it lose its way? Does liberty just become doing whatever feels good?
That's the profound question classic liberalism poses to libertarianism. It suggests that a society without a shared sense of purpose, beyond mere non-interference, struggles to justify its own existence, its laws, its sacrifices. It risks mistaking liberty for license and potentially loses the moral resources needed to sustain freedom itself over the long run. If freedom isn't for anything beyond individual whim, why defend it? Why cultivate the virtues needed for it? It raises deep questions about sustainability and meaning. So we've covered a lot of ground here, really digging into classic American liberalism and libertarianism. We've seen their core ideas, where they came from, and crucially, how they fundamentally differ on the very purpose of freedom and the role of the state.
Yeah.
One view grounding liberty in moral law, virtue, and a common good.
Liberty for something.
Right. And the other prioritizing consent and non-aggression above all, seeing liberty more as an end in itself, the right to be left alone.
And hopefully this deep dive has brought some clarity for you, the listener, on these really influential ways of thinking. Maybe challenged you to think about what freedom really means and, yeah, what is it ultimately for? What does it mean for a society or even an individual to truly flourish? Is just being free from interference enough? Or is there something more, some higher aim we should be pursuing with our liberty?
It's worth reflecting on how these different starting points, these philosophical foundations, play out in the real world, how they shape debates about everything from taxes and regulation to education and culture.
Yeah.
And it leads to that final thought. When we talk about wanting liberty, what are we really asking for? Is it just permission to do whatever we want? Or is it the ability, the framework, the conditions to pursue what is genuinely good and true?
A crucial question to ponder. Well, join us next time for another deep dive. We'll be shifting gears and turning our attention to a major force shaping the cultural landscape today, particularly on the left, woke leftism.
Right. We'll look at how it redefines core concepts like justice, often moving away from equality under law, towards ideas centered on group identity and power dynamics. How it sometimes frames society primarily as a struggle between oppressor and oppressed groups.
We'll ask, is this woke leftism a natural evolution of liberalism, or is it something fundamentally different, maybe even a rejection of core liberal principles?
And what are the implications when subjective identity, feelings, and group affiliation become central to defining truth, shaping law, controlling speech, and structuring education? Promises to be a challenging but important discussion.
We'll see you then.